Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. We appreciate it. We've got another important podcast for you today with another expert. We're grateful to Dallas Kiedrowski for being here today. Dallas, how are you today?
Doing great. It's always a great day when I get to speak to Tim Andersen.
Dallas, thank you. Please extend my best to your family. Now, Dallas, you and I met each other at a conference. We chatted pleasantly, but we didn't get to spend a lot of time together. So, before we get into this, please take a couple of minutes and tell us about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I've only come into appraisal somewhat recently. I've been doing an appraisal since 2018, but I've been in the real estate industry since 2005, 2004, 2005. I actually started as a loan officer way back in the right before the last great financial crisis. So that was kind of my first exposure to the real estate world was through that. And we kind of all know how that went. I ended up working for a large company, Irvine Company, for almost 15 years after that, and then kind of got into appraisal. And since then, I've been an appraisal coordinator. I've worked for the county as a mass appraiser. I got certified as a certified residential appraiser. And so now I work for the county and I do a little bit of fee appraisal on the side. I was one of the original, I think the third trainee at a loft appraisal, which some of your listeners might be familiar with. I don't think they do the trainee program anymore, but that's kind of where I started. So I got exposure to a lot of different techniques and supervisors at that location, and it was really good growing experience. Um, I'm also on the board of directors for the Appraisers Coalition of Washington. I'm on the executive board for the West Puget Sound chapter of the International Association of Assessing Officers, and I'm a designated member of the National Association of Appraisers.
Dallas, thank you. We've got a whole lot going on in the appraisal world right now. Now, to put this into a context, we're recording this at the end of December of 2024. So let's talk first of all, get your background in mass appraising, IAAO, et cetera. Explain to us the difference between AVMs, and we know what AVMs are, and mass appraising.
So this is a great question, Tim, and this is honestly a question that I have not been able to find an answer to. I think, you're a USPAP expert. There's lots of USPAP experts out there, but there's also those standards 5 and 6 that cover mass appraisal. And standard 5 talks about if you're doing modeling, statistical analysis, that kind of thing, that's what it describes as mass appraisal. There's no definition in USPAP for an automated valuation model or AVM, but it is referenced in a couple of advisory opinions. I think advisory opinion 18 references automated valuation models or AVMs. And USPAP, I think the definition for mass appraisal is valuing a universe of properties using statistical analysis and standard methods. If you look at kind of how AVMs are built, they're typically not built to appraise one property. AVMs are typically built to appraise a whole market area and give you a value for each of the properties in that market area. So one could say a universe of properties that they're built to appraise. So I actually am struggling. Maybe one of your listeners have the answer to this question of what is the difference from a USPAP perspective between an AVM and mass appraisal? Because if you look at the strict definitions from USPAP and Standard 5, it would sound like any AVM is mass appraisal. So that kind of leads you down the path of if you're a licensed or certified appraiser, typically state law requires that you follow USPAP. It doesn't say that you have to follow just USPAP standards 1 and 2 or 3 and 4. You have to follow all the standards in USPAP. So that raises the question of if you're a licensed appraiser and you're working on an AVM, do you need to follow standards 5 and 6 in developing that appraisal and reporting that appraisal as a mass appraisal? Um, it's a difficult question. I've talked to people on the appraisal standards board, and the answer that I got there was like, well, an AVM is appraising an individual property. Well, That's partially true because you're pulling the result for one property, but really the AVM is typically built to appraise any property in that market area. So this is a really, I think, from my perspective, mass appraisal and fee appraisal, there's kind of a convergence happening. Mass appraisal, they've been using computers since they were invented to do appraisal, basically crunch all those numbers and, analyze all that data. Well, now those databases and that analytical ability is pretty readily available to almost general public. So it's made these tools available to almost everybody now, and you have massive amounts of data to sort through. So the same skills that mass appraisers, I think, have always relied on are now being kind of sent more towards the fee appraiser side, data analytics, analyzing large databases, and pulling out adjustments and those kinds of things. That's not mass appraisal, but it's the same kind of techniques you're using as far as analyzing large databases and trying to pull out the pertinent information, if you will. So I don't know. I think this is a good question. I think it's a good question for the industry to try to explore of where is that line between an AVM and mass appraisal? How many houses do you have to be appraising for it to be a universe of properties? I think those are just good questions for the industry to kind of wrangle with as we're going towards more data analytics and that kind of thing. Maybe there should be more specifics in USPAP that kind of defines those two. But from my perspective, an AVM is a different system that typically mass appraisal will use. An AVM is typically an automated valuation model, kind of what it sounds. You plug in all the data, you put an address, boom, it spits out a value, automated. Once you kind of set it up, you don't really need to tweak it anymore. It's kind of just runs on its own. Where mass appraisers typically use a CAMA system, which is a computer-aided mass appraisal. And these are programs or databases kind of thing where we have more access to manipulate kind of everything that goes into that model, if you will. So when you're doing a mass appraisal, typically you're kind of building, I'll kind of relate this to something that fee appraisers will understand. You're kind of building the first page of the 1004. You kind of write all the pertinent information and you kind of build that record. And you're doing it from a cost approach. So you're also filling out that cost section, but you're doing it very detailed. You're getting the square footage, you're adding all the porches, all the concrete, everything there. And then we kind of build the record up, literally, from the ground up. And you have a record for every property in your county. And the database kind of rolls that all up together based on market data and that kind of thing at the end of the day. So really the only difference is how they're used, but the way that they're tested, if you're testing the results from those, it's exactly the same. You can do the same exact statistical analysis on the results from an AVM versus a CAMA system and test them in the same ways. So that's something that I think needs to get talked about more too, is the way AVMs are tested is totally different than the way that mass appraisal is tested. AVMs, from what I've seen, typically they're doing more like random sampling rather than robust statistical analysis of all of their results. Whereas on the mass appraisal side, the standards are written out specifically by the International Association of Assessment Officers, IAAO. They lay out very specific standards. So for example, the sales ratio study. When you're doing a sales ratio study, it's a study of your assessed value versus what that property actually sold for. And that's the kind of the ratio. So if the house sold for more, then you're going to have higher than more than 100%. If it sold for less, then you're going to have less than 100%. So actually, sorry, I did that backwards. If it sold for more, you're going to have lower than 90, lower than 1. If it sold for less, higher than 1. Anyways, so that's kind of your ratio score. In Washington State, the average ratio score, it was 91% for 2023. So that's kind of the accuracy of those models. When you're doing an AVM, they use a score called, I think PP10 is what they call it. And it's percentage of properties within 10% of the market or within 10% of market value. So it's kind of a different gauge that they're using. So it's a lot of times really hard to compare AVMs and mass appraisal just because they're doing different tests, and it's really just hard to compare on that level. So I would like to see more similar testing done between these systems so you can actually compare, is an AVM actually more accurate than your assessed value? I think a lot of people think that their assessed values are inaccurate, but usually most assessors are trying to keep their assessed values below 100%. They're usually trying to target 90 to probably 95%, really. The closer you get to 100%, the more properties you're going to have over 100%, meaning you're going to have more tax appeals. And typically those offices just don't have the staff to handle the amount of tax appeals that you would get if you're kind of pushing that model to the highest level. And in mass appraisal, you're more focused on equity, so spreading that evenly. So if everybody's at 95%, that's fine because you're spreading the tax burden equally. So there's no real reason to push it to 100%. So from my perspective, that's kind of some of the big differences there between AVMs and mass appraisal. But again, I think it's kind of one of those questions that's really hard to answer because USPAP doesn't define it. And I think that there's just more discussion that needs to happen around that question.
Okay, the equity part. Okay, so the property appraiser, and you're in Washington, Florida. The county property appraiser is looking for an equitable distribution of a tax burden. As a result, using a CAMA system, then what the assessor is looking for, assessor isn't going to get real, how shall we say, didactic about it because of the equity issue. And then in order to save their own budgets, so they don't have to undergo the tax appeals, because I used to work for the property appraiser's office and I used to be a tax agent. So I know that those things can be time consuming and expensive. So the 95% means, okay, we're just a little bit below market value, but then everybody is just a little bit below market value. Therefore, we're treating everybody the same.
Yes.
And yeah, you can protest your taxes, but one of your protests, one of your arguments cannot be your assessment is unfairly high because everybody's at 95%. Is that basically what we're saying?
Yeah. And so the IAAO lays out very specific standards and parameters for what makes a credible model. So in the sales ratio study, you have to have your ratio between 0.9 and 1.1. So 90% to 110%. Basically a 10% gap on either side of 100%, if you will. So as long as you're within 90 to 100%, 90 to 110%, really, you have a credible model according to IAAO. So yeah, it's very easy to defend from that perspective because we are meeting the parameters that are laid out by the technical standards in IAAO. And usually when somebody does a tax appeal, we're going to look at that property more specifically and do a little comparison. We'll probably do a little sales comparison approach right there to kind of test the model to see how accurate it is, on that individual property. And as we all know, value is more of a range than a specific number typically. And so usually if the value is within that range, it's reasonable. We're not going to fight it, if you will. In mass appraisal, when you're trying to shoot, I guess in fee appraisal, somebody described this to me, and I think this is a great description. If you compare appraisal to archery, and you were shooting a bow and arrow, and you're trying to hit the exact middle of the target, the red center of the bullseye, that's what you're trying to do in fee appraisal. In mass appraisal, the yellow around the bullseye, as long as you're in that area, you're good to go.
Good to go. Okay, let's talk about that for a minute. Now, you mentioned IAAO standards. for AVMs that county property appraisers or tax assessors use. Now, IWO's standards for AVMs for mass appraising do not apply to private AVMs. Is that correct?
Correct. I mean, IAAO is just kind of like USPAP in the fact that it's not law. It's only if your state has that in the law that mass appraisers need to follow IAAO standards, or by choice, if you're choosing to follow IAAO standards. So yeah, it's not state law unless it's in your state law. It's kind of like USPAP in that it's a recommended standard, but most, I would say almost the vast majority of assessors follow those standards. And so as we're talking about the sales ratio, and we talked about those parameters, that's just accuracy. And that's one of the things that kind of bothers me about AVMs is all they talk about is accuracy. And we were talking about equity a little bit. Well, that's a different test. So you're going to do a coefficient of dispersion test or a price-related differential test to kind of ferret out that uniformity. How many of your properties are within that 95%? If you're at 95% for your sales ratio, how many? How steep is that bell curve, if you will? That's one of those things that I think some of these AVMs are being used to show that appraisers are biased, but we don't know, there's no equity test or bias test on the AVM itself. So how do we know that the bias isn't actually coming from the AVM itself?
Right. You just mentioned bias. Let's go to something treating bias. And you have written on, is the 1 mile rule a prudent appraisal policy or is it modern redlining? So go ahead and talk to us about that. And when you say the 1 mile rule, you're talking about a Fannie Mae guideline, or excuse me, I should say a GSE guideline. So
Yeah, and I think,
talk to us about that.
yeah, and so, when we're talking about that, I think some people say that, the 1 mile rule isn't an actual rule, and they're probably right. I don't think it was ever a written rule in the GSE guidelines, but it's something that is probably coming from either the UCDP or something like that. When the reviewers are looking at that property, there's like a 1 mile circle. Anything outside of that, they're kind of questioning that. That seems to be kind of where it came from, and kind of like the 1525 rule, where it was supposed to be more of like a, hey, look at this, you should check on this. It became more of a hard and fast rule. You can't go outside of these parameters, which I don't think was the original intent. But for this discussion, we kind of got to go all the way back to redlining days. So if we look at, if somebody took all the appraisals from redlining days and you did a study on our appraisers being biased, 100%, there's no question. They were using neighborhood and racial data to do their appraisals, right? But why were they doing that? Why was that the process or the methodology back then? It was because of the underwriting manual. So for the FHA underwriting manual from the 1930s basically laid out a risk score that the appraisers were kind of scoring the property on. And one of those factors was the risk of that property being infiltrated by inharmonious racial groups. And so that's, as we know, basically turned into redlining, where you would put a red line around neighborhoods or maybe a yellow line around neighborhoods that had the risk of being infiltrated by inharmonious racial groups. It's the exact verbiage they use. So there's no doubt back then that racial composition of the neighborhood had a dramatic effect on the value of the property, right? That was the methodology back then. That became, the Civil Rights Act and all those things happened, and obviously redlining became illegal. At that point, the connection between neighborhood, racial composition, and value started separating, right? And based on some of this research that was done by, I think it was Junia Howell, Dr. Junia Howell, that she's testified at the ASC. I think there's some questions about her testing methodology and that kind of thing. But if you believe the results, that they're basically what she was saying in those results is that from 1980 to 2000, 2015, I believe it was, the neighborhood racial makeup and the value started getting closer again. So the question kind of raises, why would that happen? You know, after redlining became illegal, that got farther apart, that connection, if you will, between racial neighborhood composition and value kind of separated. It got stronger again between 1980 and 2015. So what also happened during 1980, 2015 in the mortgage world? Well, 1980s, we had the savings and loan crisis with all the savings and loans. You had the bailout. That's why we have FIREA in 1989. They bailed out all the savings and loans back then. And I think at the beginning of 1980, if you looked at it, Fannie and Freddie, which I think were created in the 1970s, they controlled about 10, 15% of the market. So about 10 or 15% of all the mortgages were sold to Fannie and Freddie in the early 1980s, I believe. If you kind of fast forward as we get towards 2000, 2015, you know, that number increased to 50, 60, 70%, depending on which metrics you believe now. So over that period, they kind of became the de facto underwriter for most mortgages. And their underwriting standards kind of became the de facto standard. One of those was the 1 mile rule. And I think that could explain why that neighborhood racial composition and that value kind of came back together again as far as being considered. Because if you're not able to go outside a 1 mile radius, then of course the neighborhood composition is always going to be considered, right? Not that the appraiser was looking at race as far as probably what they were considering, but you know, I think appraisers back then, you know, you're going to get a letter or you're going to get a something from the kickback from the underwriter if you choose a comparable sale outside of that 1 mile area. Even if you have some explanation, they might question it. So it just made appraisers avoid it. You know, I don't want to have to explain this. I'm just going to avoid getting comps outside the 1 mile area. And so, you know, is that bias in the data that Dr. Howell found, is that coming from individual appraisers, or is that a systemic thing caused by underwriters' needs to have properties within a 1 mile, comparables within a 1 mile radius? I think a lot of these research that has been done about appraisal bias doesn't really nail down. There's no study that I've seen that actually nails down the cause. They just say, we can see it in the data. And so it's more like, you know, correlation that they're making, but not really, you know, correlation doesn't make causation. So is that really the cause of where this bias is coming from? Because if you're looking at this from a systemic level, it would be hard for the individual appraiser to affect the entire system unless that was in our training or education or something like that. So I think that's where these questions need to go as far as when you're doing research on these bias questions is, what are the appraisal review standards? What are the underwriter standards? What are the GSE standards? What is causing appraisers to do what they're doing? Kind of like back to redlining days. A lot of the reasons appraisers do what they do is because they want to fit it into the underwriter's box. And that kind of influences appraisers' methodology nowadays. I think that's one of the things that I really like between mass appraisal and fee appraisal. And mass appraisal, like we were kind of discussing a little bit earlier, there's specific parameters with IAAL. So if I fit my mass appraisal within those parameters, there is no argument that I've met standards to make a credible appraisal. Whereas on the fee appraisal side, it's always an open question. USPAP is not specific, and there's just no way for you to 100% prove that your appraisal is accurate. It's more of an argument back and forth and a discussion, and you got to kind of prove your case. Is it credible or not? And that's a subjective question. So that's one of the things that I think could serve the, I think, appraiser industry a lot better, is having more specific standards in USPAP, because that would prevent some of these external pressures as far as from like the 1 mile rule, the 1525 rule, those kinds of things. If those were more specified in USPAP, appraisers would have better defense as far as defending their methodology, because you're like, well, I followed USPAP. I did exactly what I was supposed to do. I think that could go a long way to help appraisers defend their appraisals and their methodology going forward. I think there's been some discussions on a lot of forums that appraisers should be more in control of their methodology and processes, and that users of appraisal services like Fannie and Freddie should not have such a big influence on the way appraisals are done.
Thank you. That transitions into Fannie and Freddie. So let's talk about Fannie and Freddie for a while. Freddie Mac has, and specifically Freddie Mac, published a study recently in which they indicated that within certain price points, loans granted based on an AVM showed a slightly lower default rate than those based on a more traditional appraisal. Now, obviously the data are available to anybody who wants to chase it down. You can even get the spreadsheet if you want to reanalyze the data yourself. But this is something, when I first saw that, that came as quite a surprise. And in fact, Danny Wiley from Freddie Mac was on a podcast recently in which he was saying that they were surprised too to find this slight difference. And one of the interviewers said, well, okay, could it be that maybe those done with AVMs were done with far more qualified borrowers, higher FICO scores, lower loan to value ratio requests, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Thus, the comparison, in essence, fails because you're trying to compare chickens and aardvarks. So, from a standpoint of what you know about AVMs, mass appraising, et cetera, tell us, what do you think about this particular study?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I think, like you said, when you first hear that, you're like, oh, that's shocking. What, the AVMs did better than appraisals? But I feel like what the host of that other show kind of nailed it. If you look into the data on there, it's not an apples to apples comparison. The only way you're getting into this appraisal waiver system is if you're a strong credit borrower. And the way that Freddie is looking at these is not just on the value portion or the LTV value. It's a holistic look at that borrower, and their credit is a big portion of that, equation. How good is their credit? So really, I think that study just shows that stronger credit borrowers are going to have less loan defaults. I think that's what that study actually shows. It's not an actual, I don't think it speaks to appraisal quality at all, unless you had exactly compared the credit risk or credit quality of all of those borrowers the same. And so you're kind of taking that factor out of the equation from the Freddie Mac risk factors. I think that's what that study shows. So I think it's kind of it's a good marketing tool for Freddie Mac to show that this is a thing that their investors can trust. But I feel, again, that it's not an apples to apples comparison, because you're not comparing appraisal quality, you're comparing credit of the borrower quality. In that, I watched that thing with Danny Wiley as well. And in there, he said something to the effect of, we know what the forecast standard deviation is that gives us an accurate appraisal. So that's kind of interesting, because what we were talking about earlier was a sales ratio. And what we said was IAAL says it should be between 90 to 110%. So that's basically a 10% deviation. So if Freddie Mac knows what their standard deviation is for these models that makes it accurate, I don't know why they don't publicize that and just tell us why it should be a secret what makes a credible AVM from their perspective. So that seemed kind of interesting. So, and from his perspective, from Danny Wiley's perspective, that's exactly what he said, was that they made the appraisal quality as far as the AVM similar to the appraisal quality for the fee appraisals, for the actual appraisals that were done. So he's, from a mathematical perspective, he controlled for that. So again, it speaks to me more that it's talking about the quality of the credit of the borrowers, and that's why they have less loan defaults, which would make sense, than a comparison of appraisal quality between AVMs and appraisals.
And then to be clear, the difference was, I don't want to say negligible, but it was the difference between, say, 0.36% default rate and 0.42% default rate, which is very small. So
Yes, and we don't know if this was done in a neighborhood that was very homogeneous, so that AVM is able to be more accurate in that type of neighborhood, or if it was done in a rural area, or if it, there's a lot of factors there at play, not just the credit quality and you're doing an appraisal. There's a lot of factors that go into, if I choose this area where my AVM is the most accurate and I use that as my basis for data, then that's going to show well. So I think there's a lot of questions that you could ask about why they specifically chose that data and why they're showing that specific data. In that podcast, Danny also talked about one of the things that they do is sometimes they'll get an appraisal waiver that they offer, but the borrower doesn't take that offer, and then they get a full appraisal. And they kind of get to look at, they compare this appraisal now to what they predicted the value would be, right? Because they already did their AVM before they offered the appraisal waiver. So it'd be great if they released that data. Danny said that they've looked at thousands. It would be great if they showed that data. How is the AVM doing compared to actual appraisals done on the same property? What is the results of those? Were those loan defaults more? Were those more accurate? Those kinds of things. So Freddie Mac shows us what they wanted to, but I think it'd be really interesting to get really deep into their data and show some real statistical analysis would be what I would love to see.
Okay. Dallas, you've raised a lot of absolutely fascinating and provocative points. If someone wanted to get in touch with you, what is your email address?
So my email is olympicvaluation, all one word, at gmail.com. Again, that's olympicvaluation@gmail.com. That's my private little appraisal company, my one-man show that I do out here on the peninsula.
Yeah, well, that'll be on the screen. And let's see, have you got any speaking engagements scheduled in the first quarter of 2025?
Yeah, so next year I'll be speaking at the West Puget Sound chapter of IAAO's spring conference and giving a legislative update it's a conference for mass appraisers, so probably not as interesting to fee appraisers, but I'll be doing the legislative update there. It's more focused on our state, Washington State, as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Will you be at any of the national conventions next year?
I'm trying to go to a few next year. IAAO has a really big conference next year in Orlando in September. I really want to go to that one. I will definitely be, I'm going to do a little plug here for our ACAL. ACAL Spring Conference is going to be in Spokane next May. I will definitely be there as well. I don't know if I'll be speaking. I might be helping out with one of the panels, but we're going to have some really great speakers at that event, highest best use and stuff that's really kind of pertinent for the average fee appraiser right now. So look for that coming out May of next year for the ACAO Spring Conference.
Excellent. Do you have anything that has been recently published or is going to be published soon?
Well, so I was this AVM versus mass appraisal thing. There was an article that came out by, I think it was Business Insider, that kind of talked about, I think their headline for the article was, is Zillow screwing up the housing market? Which I think most appraisers would probably agree with, say, yes, it is. But, in that article, it laid out a little taste of the accuracy numbers that Zillow kind of puts out. And Zillow's the same way. They're only going to release just the data that makes them look good, obviously. But they, again, use that like PP10 metric, which is how many properties are within 10% of the market value. And in that article, it kind of lays out, it was really interesting, that when Zillow knows the list price of the property, it's like 95% accurate based on these numbers. Again, this is hard to compare because we're using different statistical measures between mass appraisal and AVM, but again, we're just going to run with what the numbers they're showing us. So like 95%, I think it was in Austin that he compared it to. Well, it was interesting that he lays out in that article too, that there's a shadow AVM that they kind of run in the background, where that AVM that you don't see is also running without the list price. And Zillow uses that to compare, okay, this is the Zestimate that we have publicly that knows the list price. This is the AVM that's running in the background that doesn't know the list price. How well did they do? Where's that error, right? And if you look at the model that doesn't have the list price, that falls into the 70% range. I think Seattle was like 69%. That's pretty low as far as accuracy for an AVM. And if we're talking about mass appraisal, comparing that to mass appraisal, as we kind of talked about earlier, every county in the state of Washington was at, if you average them all, was at 91%. So this is where I'm confused why there's so much faith put into AVMs. And I use the word faith purposefully, because if you haven't seen their test results, then you're relying on your faith that it's accurate or it's equitable. On the mass appraisal side, all the results, because public data, you can go pull all the results from the tests that were done by the Department of Revenue that show the accuracy, the uniformity, and all that of our models. So from just a strictly data standpoint, what you can actually verify, from my perspective, obviously mass appraisal is much easier to verify and come to grips with. And for good reason. I mean, that's used to determine your property taxes. So you should be able to know that it's accurate. AVMs, as they're getting more popular in use, they give out this confidence score, which they don't really explain a lot of times what that all encompasses or how they got to that confidence score. So again, you're kind of putting faith in these developers that these numbers are accurate. And I think, Zillow went on their home buying spree, and that was a huge disaster. Lost hundreds of millions of dollars trusting their model. So again, it blows my mind that people themselves are putting so much trust in this model when Zillow themselves lost so much money doing the same thing. I think there's just a lot to be said for data transparency around these models. Fannie and Freddie do not show any accuracy or uniformity or any kind of data accuracy on their, UCDP or the AVM that they're running in there. I think it would behoove the entire industry to know how accurate these models are. Are they more accurate than your assessment? I think this is going to be a big kind of interesting question as we go down this road. There's no AVM that I don't think that you could get as equitable as mass appraisal. Mass appraisal systems are always going to be typically more uniform because they're based on a cost approach. So they're a lot easier to make that a uniform because you're using the same base for all that data, right? So it may not be quite as accurate all the time, but it's going to be more uniform. So if you're at 95%, you're going to have more properties at 95%. AVMs, you can maybe get more accurate, but they're probably not going to be as uniform. So I think that's one of those things that, maybe need to come into effect. Maybe you use a hybrid model that does cost and sales approach and kind of merges those two together. I think that's going to be the future of appraising. I think the average fee appraiser should get more used to AVMs, how they work, modeling, just so you can speak to it intelligently. Maybe you're not using that technology, but if a question is asked of you, or if you kind of come up against an AVM, you can speak to intelligently to why they should trust your appraisal versus the AVM. I think that's a skill that most fee appraisers should develop, and it'll serve them very well going forward. But yeah, I think that there's just this confluence happening between mass appraisal and fee appraisal that, for whatever reason, doesn't get talked about a lot. It seems like the skills from both sides, or the disciplines from both sides, could learn skills from each other and help each other, I think, grow and build this public trust into the appraisal profession. This is a question I thought about a lot too. USPAP the purpose of USPAP is for public trust, right? So let's think about that. If you're a commercial appraiser, how often do you interact with the public? If you're the general public, you may never in your whole life interact with this commercial appraiser, probably, right? Fee appraiser, certified or licensed appraiser, maybe a couple of times in your life you're going to be dealing with a fee appraiser or certified appraiser, right? But a mass appraiser, you probably get that. If you're a homeowner, you get that value every year from your mass appraiser showing what your value is. And maybe you go in and do your tax appeal, that kind of thing. So I think mass appraisal can have a big effect on public trust in the appraisal space as well. I think fee appraisal, mortgage appraisal just gets talked about more, and it's kind of more in the public space. And that does affect, obviously, we've seen with the bias thing and all that, it obviously can affect the public trust in our appraisal profession. But I think mass appraisal can also have a dramatic effect on public trust, and we need to all work together to make sure that public trust is ensured and going in the right direction. One of the things that happened recently, this is a kind of a tangent, but an interesting story. I had an appraiser call me in Washington State, and this appraiser was getting an appraisal done on their house. They're doing a refinance, so he's a licensed appraiser. He's not doing the appraisal on his house. He's getting a refinance, so another appraiser is doing the appraisal on his house. And that appraisal came in lower than his assessed value. So he brought that appraisal to do a tax appeal. And that tax appeal was basically, he lost, if you will, the tax appeal. And the decision in the tax appeal was that there's essentially kind of like a precedent, if you will, in the tax appeal system where you can kind of quote older judgments. And they did that in this case. They said that there was an appraisal. They said generally appraisals done for mortgage are conservative. That's what they said. And so this is why they didn't put any weight into that appraisal, which is really interesting, right? Because you have an appraiser who's able to review that appraisal himself. It's for his house. You have two appraisers basically saying, this is a good appraisal. But the Board of Tax Appeals wouldn't even look at it, essentially, because in their precedent, they're like, hey, mortgage appraisals are conservative, which is kind of silly. So I followed that trail back, and it cited a precedent from a couple of years ago, which cited another precedent from a couple of years ago, all the way back to 2005. And the original precedent was from an appraisal that they reviewed this one appraisal in 2005 and determined that this one appraisal was conservative. And then that turned into all appraisals for mortgage are conservative. So that's kind of a big problem from my perspective. You having the Board of Tax Appeals is basically saying we don't trust appraisals from fee appraisers. That's going to cause a lot of public trust issues. I think so. This is where that the rubber meets the road, if you will. You know, we need to be coordinating better between all of the disciplines, I think, on these kinds of things when we're interacting with the public, because from the public's perspective, they're like, what the heck? I got an appraisal from a fee appraiser. Now you're telling me it's no good. That doesn't make a lot of sense from the public perspective. So yeah, that's one of the things that I really want to focus on in the next coming years, is trying to bring the disciplines together so that we can have a unified front to the public and build that public trust back up.
Dallas, again, please give us your email address.
So it's olympicvaluation, all one word, at gmail.com. I'm with Olympic Valuation, my little one-man show out here on the peninsula.
Dallas, again, thank you. We appreciate it. And please let me thank you person to person, appraiser to appraiser. Let me wish you and your family my best, also from my family. And I look forward to the next time we get to shake hands.
Yeah, Tim, it's always a pleasure speaking with you. I very appreciate you having me on here, and it's just been an honor speaking with you today. Thank you so much. Much love to you
It
and your
won't be the last.
family. I hope you guys have a great year. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you again soon.